As I said, we're going to talk about a little bit about queen biology and basics of backyard queen production. So all of you know that there are three castes. We're going to focus obviously on the queen. So queens are females that are worker bees. So what makes them different? What is it that leads to them being different, that brings about the differences? Because their genes are the same. In the case of the queen, certain genes are turned on by the kind of food she's fed. So it's receiving that higher quality, higher protein, higher fat food, which we call royal jelly, receiving a lot more of it, that makes a queen instead of a worker. So we need to keep that idea, the importance of large amounts of royal jelly, in mind when we raise queens. So whatever method we need, well, in addition, whatever method we use to raise queens, and there's a lot of different methods beyond grafting, you need to select very young larvae to graft from or to raise the queens from, definitely less than 2 days old. So a 1 day old is ideal, less than 24 hours. Let's say an 18-hour queen is a good idea too. It's sometimes hard to find the exact thing that you want. So older larvae will receive less royal jelly. They will have had less opportunity, a shorter period in which to receive that, and some of them will be just less productive queens. A few, depending on how old they are, may become what's called intercaste, which in essence are part worker and part queen. The queen produces a complex mixture of chemicals, pheromones, which is often given the name queen substance, and this alters the worker's behavior. It says to the workers that this is a productive queen present. So I don't want to spend much time on swarming, but I want to make the point that most beekeepers believe that the best queens in terms of the quality of nutrition they receive, quality of care, if you will, occur during the swarm season. And so I want, again, to keep that in mind, because what we need to do as queen producers is to mimic as best we can what conditions occur in the hive during that period, during the period when swarms are cast. So most years in our area, that's from late April into June. This is going to vary. In Chicago, it's obviously going to start later. In southern Illinois, it's going to start earlier. So what are those conditions that occur during a swarm, or during that swarming period? So you have large populations of workers and lots of drones in healthy colonies. That's what we're talking about, healthy colonies, ones that are capable of producing a swarm. You have lots of nectar coming in, lots of pollen available, so there's a lot of food and good quality food in the terms of fresh pollen. And sometimes during this period, colonies can actually become honey-bound or nectar-bound, and or bound partially at least with many frames of pollen. And that crowds the brood nest and acts as a stimulus to swarming. So that's why during this period you need to add honey supers. So another point I want to make, taking a little tangent here, is that beekeepers increasingly are recognize that we're better off with locally raised and at least locally or regionally adapted queens and bees. But there's a lot of reasons why we buy bees from the Sun Belt, and actually we're going to skip those reasons because of limited time. So what kinds of things do we need in order to raise queens? What kind of skills, what kinds of and what kinds of implements or equipment? So you should have some hands-on experience. Merely reading is insufficient for most of us. It's a good idea, if possible, learn from a mentor, follow them around. Attend queen rearing workshops. This presentation was given at Three Rivers quite a while ago, and in presentations at the Illinois Queen Initiative. I think following up after you've taken that workshop, whether it's going again and working with a mentor or maybe a follow-up workshop is a good idea. So what are the basic necessities in terms of supplies? Well, you need supplies for grafting or non-grafting methods, whichever you're going to choose to use. You're going to need to establish a cell starter and a cell finisher colony, or in some cases a colony that does both. In order to get those queens mated, assuming you're not just going to replace the queens in your colonies, you're going to need nuclei, which are small colonies used for mating. And the number of nuclei you have, which is a function in part of the number of bees you have to stock those nuclei, is what limits the number of queens, mated queens, that you can produce. You also should start with queens from stocks with desirable traits such as disease and mite resistance, productivity, and gentleness. So this is just to remind you, quick timeline for queen development. You can see that the queen, I'm trying to read my own, the queen is develops much more rapidly than a worker, and considerably more rapidly than drone taking 24 days, basically, give or take a little, depending on the line. The worker 21 days, and the queen 16. So that's a figure you should keep in mind. Depending on how old the larva is, you need to realize that that queen may come out in the case of a one-day-old larva in about, if I'm doing my math right, in about 12 days. So I mentioned grafting and non-grafting. I'm not going to go into any detail. You will have the opportunity to practice some of these, grafting in particular. So it involves transferring tiny larvae that ideally you can't even see unless you've got incredibly acute vision, into artificial cell cups, queen cell cups. They could be made of plastic. They can be, you can make or perhaps even buy ones made out of beeswax. It's not for everyone. One-day-old larvae are nearly invisible. Some people have told me you don't need to see them. You just look for a cell that has the royal jelly in there, the shining sort of milky liquid in the bottom, and you just scoop. So it's difficult to learn well within a 1 to 2 day class. Again, an argument for taking the class and then trying to get an opportunity to observe someone who does this on a regular basis. I think a number of beekeepers would actually benefit from at least starting with non-grafting methods like the Miller method, the cell punch method, or gender type kits. And I'm going to talk a very little bit about several of these. So here's a subjective comparison of the 4 different methods I've mentioned. Grafting, the Miller method, which I actually won't say any more about, the cell punch, and the Genter, Nicot, and those are all very similar. So grafting gives you excellent control of timing. So the timing is within limits, for instance, whether the queen you want to breed from has an adequate supply of brood of the right age, the weather, etc. But apart from that, you have good control of timing with grafting. But I think amongst these 4 methods, it's the most difficult. Now that's probably because I had difficulty with it. So the Miller method, which you can Google, because I'm not going to spend basically much more time than now on it, I think gives you moderate control of timing. And I think it's probably the one that is least difficult. The cell punch also gives you pretty good control of timing. It's also rather cheap, as is the Miller method, and it's quite easy. The Genter kits are, in my opinion, they give you the least control of timing. I'll come back to that in a moment. And the key here is the queen has to cooperate. So in my experience, I was warned by a friend of mine who used the Nicot system, again, very similar to the Genter system, that not all queens want to lay in these boxes. Well, the first queen I used didn't mind. She was young, and I'm not saying it's because she was young. She went in there and laid within 24, 48 hours. There were eggs. I removed her. She had done what she needed to do. But it seems like almost all the other queens I've tried to use are resistant to that. And if you pay $200 to $300 for a breeder queen, and she's not laying in that box, and you know that these queens are subject to being superseded readily anyway, in my case at least, it means I'm going to pull her out after 2 or 3 days if she shows no signs of cooperating. The gender kits and NICOT are not really expensive, less than $100 to at least get started. So money shouldn't be too much of a consideration. If you sell three, 4, or 5 queens, certainly you should be able to make up that amount. One way you can gain some control over timing with respect to grafting or the Miller method or cell punch is you confine the queen to relatively few frames. That way she doesn't have as much choice. The gender NICOT system, that you've already confining the queen to a small box. So that doesn't apply to this. So in this case, because it's the only example I have, I've got a picture of a photo of a single deep. It's got a division down the middle, which is separating into two colonies, but you could well-nigh imagine you could move that division over so you've got 3 frames, one of which would have pollen and honey, and the other one perhaps with that honey, and you give her a single frame in which she can lay. A nice clean frame, dark one, so you can see, if you're grafting particularly, you can see the larvae as much as you can. And she is normally going to lay on that. And you wouldn't want to leave her in there for a long time because, again, you're interfering with her ability to get around and lay eggs throughout the hive. So here's a photo of a gender box. And it is about roughly 5 by 5, I would say. I think NICOT may be a little bigger.
NICOT's about 7, and then gender is like 5.
Yeah, and it really is. It's really neat when it works. Thereby lies the rub, as they say. So you can't, in my opinion, if you want to use the NICOT or genter, and particularly if you're wanting to focus on a particular breeder queen, especially one that has the genetics you want, an instrumentally inseminated queen, for example, you can't depend solely on using the genter or NICOT, as nice as it works when it works. The cell punch method, again, this depending on which workshop you're attending, this may be demonstrated. They're actually coring devices, cell punch equipment and basic methods. And if they're going to be shown, will be shown after the slideshow. And there doesn't seem to be a really good website on cell punch. There are a couple of YouTube videos you can look up. So Google cell punch method, bees, and you'll get to those videos. So I talked about cell starter, cell finisher. Most methods use a 2-step system. Regardless of however the larvae are transferred into those cell cups. The cell starter is actually for inserting a larvae into a queenless colony that causes the bees to start feeding those larvae well. You've chosen the age of the larvae. You're feeding that cell starter with pollen substitute and syrup. Even if you've got pollen coming in, you can't tell if it's going to rain or something like that, or maybe the quality of pollen or the diversity of pollen is inadequate. They'll take it if they need it. Some cases they won't take it. Of course, the other one is a cell finisher. So after 24 hours, you move them into a cell finisher. That's a queen-right colony, but the queen can't get her access to the cell cups. The developing larvae is blocked by the use of a queen excluder. So this is already I've gone over this OL. Oh, the other thing is you want to load that cell starter with a very large number of nurse bees. So you have more nurse bees than you possibly need. These nurse bees will be highly motivated to deposit their royal jelly that they produce into the cell cups where these larvae are, which will then again trigger the genes in those larvae to make them queens. They need to be fed continuously. That is the cell starter 1-to-1 sugar syrup and pollen substitute. I already mentioned why. Cell finisher is also a very strong queen-right colony crowded with nurse bees. May have a frame of larvae next to the queen cells, which helps draw those nurse bees to the queen cells. It feeds the developing larvae until they pupate. Then you can remove them. It's also fed continuously, and cap cells remain in a finisher around 9 to 10 days. You don't need to remove them. You don't need to remove them immediately that they're capped and they are more fragile, but you do need to be mindful again of how many days it's going to take. 10 is generally the outside figure I would use. If you do not do that and the first queen hatches out, she will go and destroy all of the queen cells. Everybody that's raised queens have had this experience minimally once, in some cases more times. So I like, for a small-scale producer, the cloakboard method, because what that does is combines a cell starter and cell finisher into one colony. It uses a single, very strong colony, which you may need to boost with extra nurse bees. And it should have a first-year queen that's gentle. And the reason for having a first-year queen, well, gentle because you're going to need to work in that colony a bit, unless you like defensive bees. First year because you're also, with all that crowding, creating conditions that are conducive to swarming, and so a first-year queen is less likely to swarm on you. You'll need a support colony from which you can perhaps remove frames of open brood, of larvae, and the adhering nurse bees. And then when it's ready to remove them, you put them back, that is the frames of the larvae, not the nurse bees, into the support colony. You also need a cloak board, and we will show you one after this slideshow. The other things you'll need, again, I mentioned nukes. These can be 2 to 5 frame nukes or queen castles, or they can be mini nukes, which are more difficult to manage than using standard size frames, whether they're mediums or deeps. The reason they're more difficult is that they, with a very small amount of comb area, they can plug out with honey, or they can go through that honey really rapidly. In my experience, they're much more prone to being robbed. I don't use them anymore, although I have a few in my shed. So here, again, is another example of just a deep hive body that's divided into two. And these are 2 different colonies that could be used for raising queens, or you could have individual mating nukes that are 5 frames or 4 frames. Again, I mentioned this before, you want stock that is adapted to your area, that survived without treatment for at least 4 years. That is, the stock has, not the individual breeder queen you're using. And also, I would advocate getting breeder queens, instrumental inseminated breeder queens from VSH, Russians, or New World Carniolans. I wouldn't push the New World Carniolans as much as I used to, because I haven't seen studies showing their degree of resistance to varroa. And you need a queen mating yard, a home yard, ideally. And in theory, you have 3 to 4 drone mother yards surrounding that nuke yard within, in 4 different directions, within 1/2 to 1.5 miles. So these should also be quite strong colonies, because you want them to produce lots of drones, and you want them to be mite resistant as well as disease resistant. And you should recognize that if you've got frames in there, which you should have, that are drone frames, you're also creating the possibility of mite production. This basically is the end of the talk. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them